Freedom of speech and liberty is always fragile and always needs to be protected. And Jehovah's Witnesses are on the forefront. I always like to say they're kind of the canary in the First Amendment coal mine, because what happens to them is what's going to happen to us.
That was director Joel Engardio discussing his powerful new film, Knocking, with Dan Mack, Director of Litigation at the ACLU's Program on Freedom of Religion and Belief, moderated by Religious Studies Professor Stephen Dunning of the University of Pennsylvania. The program, recorded at the National Constitution Center on May 9th, 2007, begins after this. Here at the Constitution Center, tonight, we're very honored to present the film Knocking, a revealing documentary about Jehovah's Witnesses appearing before the Supreme Court, 62 times. These cases have proven to be pivotal moments in the formation of constitutional law and have demonstrated the underlying message that the protection of religious liberty and the advancement of personal freedoms need not be competing values. To my immediate right is Joel Engardio. He's the director and producer of Knocking. In addition to directing and producing this wonderful film, he's also an award-winning writer and journalist. He's written for publications such as the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Newsweek. In television, Joel has worked as an associate producer for ABC News at News Magazine 2020 and the network's documentary unit Turning Point. Joel was born and raised in Saginaw, Michigan, where his mom was the only member of a large Italian Catholic family to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
I'd like to start our discussion about this wonderful, wonderful film by looking at its title, Knocking, and thinking about what this means to Jehovah's Witnesses, about what this really means spiritually. What is the spiritual motivation and payoff for doing this?
I think one of the great misconceptions of Jehovah's Witnesses is that there's a quota system, or they need to knock on a certain number of doors or get a certain number of converts to make it into paradise, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. It's fulfilling enough for the witness just to have the privilege, or even to be commanded to spread the good news. That was the book of Matthew, following Jesus' example, to spread the good news of God's kingdom. So my mother, who has been knocking on doors for nearly 30 years, she's never made a convert in 30 years. But she continues to knock because she feels it's her commandment to do so, and she feels fulfilled. And the other thing about witnesses is they aren't activists in the sense of trying to fix the world's problems today. They feel their role is, when they go door to door knocking, that they're telling people about a solution that's going to come soon via God, Jehovah God. So that's also part of their fulfillment. They feel like they're, helping their neighbor in that regard.
Why is it religiously important? Why is it spiritually important in a country that is so welcoming and so supportive to continue to stand in a position of distance, if not actual resistance?
Because ultimately, Jehovah's Witnesses only view God's kingdom as worthy of allegiance or being subject to. So even if America is a great country and offers a lot of great things, ultimately it's still a man-made entity. So religiously, theologically, they say something created by man can never solve the world's problems, and so it should not be given any allegiance. Now, they use scripture that talks about, give Caesar's things back to Caesar, so therefore they're not anarchists. They'll pay their taxes even if they know the money goes to war or things they disagree with, and they'll obey the law of man-made government up until the point where it starts to infringe on what they feel is their right to worship. They wouldn't be activists in the sense they wouldn't protest the government or try to petition or do a sit-in or something like this. They would just simply live their life the way they feel God has commanded them to live their life. We saw Lillian Gabaitis here in the film, and she says, people criticize me and say, how can you enjoy the freedoms of our Constitution when you wouldn't support the good war and fight Hitler? And she says, well, my husband was a German who refused to fight in Hitler's army. If everyone refused to fight, what war would we have? So they look at the bigger picture and above nationalism of any nation. what interests me, and is not, unfortunately, in the film because we only have 53 minutes, but 60 years later, Jehovah's Witnesses are still relevant to today because their most recent Supreme Court case was in 2002, the first free speech case after 9/11. And that issue was, should we have anonymity protected in our free speech clause? And a town in Ohio said no. We don't want people knocking on doors anonymously. We want to regulate. You have to get permission from the government to go knock on a door. And the court took the case, which was interesting because it makes you wonder, if they settled this 60 years ago, why are they taking the case after 9/11? Is it to uphold what they already did, or is it to question it? And the court ruled 8-1 in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses, but the Chief Justice ruled against the witnesses. So freedom of speech and liberty is always fragile and always needs to be protected. And Jehovah's Witnesses are on the forefront. I always like to say they're kind of the canary in the First Amendment coal mine, because what happens to them is what's going to happen to us.
So true. I'd like to ask people who have questions to come forward. This evening is being taped.
I was just curious your motivation and what made you decide to do the documentary, and after doing the documentary, how do you now feel about the religion from as you were as a child and now, 20-something years later?
Well, you all know my background, that my mom was a witness, and then I was raised in it and went door to door, and ultimately decided not to join. Went off to college, became a journalist, and I think I'll kind of argue with my mom a little bit because as I mentioned, witnesses feel fulfilled that they're telling people that the solutions are coming soon, and I will say, well, I'd rather spend some time working on solutions now. And I thought, well, being a journalist was a good way, to illuminate some of the problems in the world. So that's kind of how we agree to disagree. I think a bigger message too is, we are in the middle of a culture war right now, and how do we deal with that? ACLU has to defend everyone's right under the Constitution, and we're talking about groups who vehemently disagree with each other. And so, to me, I look at Jehovah's Witnesses. Here's an example of a group that stands firm in its faith, has clear, defined beliefs that may not agree with with other groups, but there's nothing that's hurtful to the rest of society other than perhaps an inconvenience of speaking a message at your door. But when that message is done being said, Jehovah's Witnesses don't go behind the person's back and amend the Constitution to force people to live in their worldview, which a lot of religions try to do. Or Jehovah's Witnesses don't legislate their beliefs. So it seems like, well, here's an interesting example of how two polar opposites can exist peacefully with each other in American society. And the irony that Jehovah's Witnesses have won court cases that benefit groups they disagree with.
The greatest tragedy is what we saw so vividly portrayed in the film, and that is the broken relationships within families. Families who cannot function any longer in unity when religion takes one or more members of the family away from the others. And it can happen with mainstream religions, it can happen with new religious movements, and it is a real tragedy, I think.
It was important to me in picking the families that we followed. It was important to me I found families that had non-believing members, because to me that reflects the reality of most Jehovah's Witness families. The majority of Jehovah's Witness families aren't all, nuclear and extended family, all witnesses. So, and the issue of how families can navigate this I thought was important, because, some people ask, what things would you want to criticize about Jehovah's Witnesses? And I thought it would be much more organic to just have it come from within the story. So here you have two real families, and you've got members who are devout and members who don't like it. And so how does that work? And that reflects what Jehovah's Witnesses go through all the time. I'll tell you why I chose to put the grandmother, her line, there's the grandmother who says, I hate that cult word, but boy, it's kind of the way it is. I put that up there early on in the film because this is for PBS. Most people who watch this will be non-witnesses. And what do non-witnesses, what do non-witnesses think of you? They think you're a cult, right? So it's meeting people where they're at. So they can be like, okay, all right, yeah, I hear what Grandma's saying.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie, it's just a mirror to reality. Ultimately, you see, well, they're not holed up in a compound in Idaho, or they're not, they're working, they're going to school, they look like normal people. I mean, Grandma shows up at the hospital, so it's like, you realize, oh, okay. So, so that's why that's there.
Yeah.
I know it's a controversial thing, but it's on both sides. The non-witnesses, if that wasn't in there, they'd be like, what is this, a promotional piece for the witnesses? You got to show how people are thinking on both sides of the aisle, and and then they can come to some common understanding.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a program of the National Constitution Center and its Annenberg Center for Education and Outreach. For more information, go to constitutioncenter.org.